And Cyril Ramaphosa has warned that anarchy will not be tolerated in South Africa. He was responding to fears that the EFF shutdown on Monday may bring destruction. He has also warned that there will not be regime change emanating from protests. Joining us is Dr. Chidochashe Nyere from the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, and he is standing by to speak to us about the DNA of regime change. Thank you very much, Doc, for your time this afternoon. Let's start with hearing from the President himself about what he has to say or his understanding of what regime change is.
Regime change can only come about through the vote. It cannot come about through anarchy, unleashing disorder in a country. The right to protest is enshrined in our Constitution. It's deeply embedded in our Constitution, and it is a right that we as South Africans fought for and won, so that South Africans can protest against what may be issues that they don't agree with. But that right is not absolute.
Having observed what's been happening over the past couple of days, how would you characterize regime change? And is what the EFF doing on Monday, can we even closely associate it to that?
Good afternoon to you and to the viewers. So regime change, in essence, it is to change from the establishment. So the establishment, in this case, we are speaking about the ANC, because this is the party that represents the state. Now, regime change can come in various forms. So President Ramaphosa is quite right to say regime change can easily come through the ballot. So that's one way. The other way will be to protest. As he correctly says, that the Constitution allows for protests. And the EFF has called for a national shutdown in protest of this regime, the establishment that President Ramaphosa presides over. And so it's a form of regime change that Mr. Malema, through his EFF, is trying to effect. So regime change in this sense, President Ramaphosa is limited, or rather should be limited in his pronouncements on how people should effect regime change, because it is actually in protest of his government that has been perceived as untransforming and as inherently corrupt. So unfortunately, his statement in terms of how regime change should come about really should not come from him, because he has a lot of issues that can be critiqued on him. So it's unfortunate that he sees a protest, a march, a shutdown as something that is untoward. It is very well enshrined in the Constitution. The EFF has the right to call for regime change. It has the right to call for protest, and so it is well within the ambit of the law. So unless there are elements that want to hijack and impose criminality, then that's a different case, in which case, anyway, the law enforcement agents should take their rightful place and arrest that.
Let's take a look, listen at this in terms of what the President has had to say about South Africa's security forces.
Security forces of our country are going to defend our people. They are going to make sure that intimidation, anarchy and disorder does not prevail. But those who want to protest, by all means, you protest peacefully. But if you are going to restrict the rights of other people, if you are going to coerce them, if you are going to intimidate them and unleash violence, our security forces are going to defend the people of South Africa.
And we just heard a few moments ago from the Secretary General of the ANC saying a shutdown is challenging the authority of the state. And so there you go. The state sees this as a challenge to its authority. Given our history on the continent and, well, arguably even what is happening to date with a suppression of democratic practices. How then do we characterize this, or how should we understand this rhetoric, not only from the president, but from the party itself, that this is a challenge of the authority of the state?
So the state may very well perceive this as a challenge to its establishment. Granted that. However, calling for a national shutdown or calling for a protest, it is not tantamount to being illegal. It is not tantamount to breaking the law. So as long as the protest or the march or the shutdown is done within the ambit of the law, there is no challenge to the state, because it is the state that should grant the freedom of those that would elect to participate in the shutdown or in the protest to do so. So they should also protect those. So that's one angle that is quite silent. All right. The characterization has been that because the EFF is perceived in a manner that is very leftist, they are anti-establishment, and therefore they are prone to be violent. But this is not the issue. Mr. Malema is on record calling for a peaceful protest. So that's one aspect of it. However, I should also be quick to add that should members of the public, be it EFF or any other political party that they want to represent, should then engage in issues of violence and issues of threatening people and intimidation, that would be wrong. And therefore, only in that sense is the president correct to say the law enforcement will have to come into effect and take its course. So the law has to protect all people here, be it those that choose to participate in the shutdown or those that do not recognize this call for a shutdown. The law should not be selective, otherwise then impunity becomes the order of the day. The law is a standard which should apply to everyone, those who are protesting and those who do not protest. So it's really broad, and it should be established that it is actually something that is objective, and therefore every citizen should follow the ambit of the law.
I do not even know how to frame this, so maybe let me state outright that I'm asking this very carefully, right? Maybe just observing what is also happening on the continent, and even outside the continent. So I close my eyes and I think of what happened in Sri Lanka. You see regime change. I close my eyes and I think of what's happening in what now is called the coup belt of West Africa. You see a lot of regime change, undemocratic at that. And so when you take a look at what is happening in South Africa, and hence with this language of this is a form of regime change, the preempting of violence, the preempting and the creation of an atmosphere of fear in this country at this time, when there's real bread and butter issues that people are grappling with. What then do you perhaps perceive is the future of South Africa, right? So we always talk about this constitution that is world class and our democracy, which is world class. Do we then run the risk of going in a path less desired?
So you are quite right to say that this phenomenon of regime change, if we want to characterize it in that way, is not exclusive to South Africa. You correctly mentioned that in Africa it's happening all over. Maybe let me just share 3 other incidences. So in Tunisia, in Tunis, the capital, on Monday the 20th, there is also a protest similar to the one that the EFF is calling for. And it is led by the Labour Union and opposition political parties to the establishment of President Kais Saied. Right? In Kenya as well, Mr. Raila Odinga is leading a protest on the same day, the 20th of March, against President Samuel Ruto's regime. So this is happening in Kenya as well. It is also happening in Nigeria, funny enough. They've just come out of an election, but that election is being contested. And so there is a march again in Nigeria to protest President Tinubu's election. So the one that Malema is calling for through the EFF is not unique to South Africa. It's something that has been happening worldwide and all over, like you correctly said, Sri Lanka. But we should then look at the Constitution. And I like the fact that you bring the Constitution into this. And the Constitution of South Africa, for real, it is world class. And it is that Constitution that allows protest, that allows dissent. Because we cannot have a state, we cannot have a country where people sing from the same hymn sheet. It cannot be. So even within the EFF, there are differences within that organization. Even in the ANC, there are differences in the organization. Even the state itself, right? It is unitary, yes, but there are differences in terms of policy and in terms of policy positions. So differing on a matter should not really be characterized in terms of regime change. And unfortunately, it is something that authorities here in South Africa, they tend to do. So what President Ramaphosa was actually doing was securitizing the very issue of protest. Because now when you speak about regime change in the sense and tone that he is speaking in, it suggests then that protest, dissent, and calling for a shutdown is tantamount to terrorism, which is not. So the issue of securitization works in this way. You frame a matter and you want to imply that it is a security threat to the state and to the establishment. And this is not what the EFF is necessarily calling for. They are actually calling for the resignation of the president. And it is through the Constitution that they have a right to do so because they perceive that the president has been found wanting, especially in terms of corruption on the Palafala saga. So this is what the EFF is actually saying. And to then want to characterize their call for a protest as a matter of state security would be wrong. However, I also want to add to say it is good that the president has stated or has implied that security forces are on high alert. This is quite good because we have seen in recent history, we can speak of the Vuani protests where about 21 schools were burnt down. This incident was known to security enforcement agencies, but they didn't act on time. And we can also speak about the July 21 protests, the July 21 unrest, where criminal elements hijacked that protest and there was a lot of looting. So it is good for the law enforcement agents to be on high alert because you do not know, you never know, and these protests are unpredictable. However, they are legitimate. So that's what I want to underscore. The protests are legitimate. There are a lot of issues that people are dealing with.
I think,
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we can afford. Thank you very much for your indulgence. Dr. Chidochashe Nyere is with the University of Johannesburg.